After these amendments were passed, the FDA looked at the National Science Foundation, which wanted to take all of these, basically all of these compounds off the market, all of these fixed combinations, almost all of them. I think they left one or two on the market. And Upjohn sued. It had Pan-Elba, which was a combination of tetracycline and novobiocin. And it accounted for about 13% of Upjohn's sales. So of course, it was, that was a big blow to overnight be told they couldn't market this compound. So they sued for an evidentiary hearing. They wanted to present their evidence that this was a good thing. FDA refused to listen to them. And that's why Upjohn sued. And the FDA said, we are not going to look at this unless you provide us evidence of effectiveness. And Upjohn argued, well, we've been selling it for 13 years. You never had any objection. It's a very widespread use. The doctors love it. That should show you that we have some evidence of effectiveness. And the FDA said, no, we don't believe in that, even though they had just told the National Science Foundation to consider that as evidence for effectiveness. So here the FDA was not being ethical in the way they treated the situation. So Upjohn argued that I should back up a minute. So then the FDA responded by saying, okay, here's what you have to provide us, Upjohn, if you want to keep these drugs on the market. And it was a lot of work because, as we'll see in a minute, it was very elaborate human trials that the FDA wanted. And FDA said, okay, well, we're willing to do that, but, we need to have a little time to do it. And the FDA said, no, we're not going to give you that time. The courts agreed with the FDA, so they didn't have any time to produce those studies, and Pan-Elba was taken off the market. So there were other companies suing as well. I can't get into that for time reasons, but the courts eventually ruled that no more drug companies could sue the FDA because the FDA had weird requirements or decided to accept the data of one company and not the other. And so really the companies had no recourse anymore. And they really felt betrayed because the FDA had not been consistent. It allowed what the doctors prescribed or medical practice to keep some drugs on the market, but not others, even though the drugs were similar. And the companies didn't have the time to meet the new regulations. They couldn't sue the FDA if the FDA favored one company over another. So not surprisingly, the FDA started taking bribes to favor one company over the other. And this was this was especially true in the generic drugs, which the FDA for some reason did not like. So they actually basically took whatever bribes they felt they could get away with in that part of the industry. And eventually one of the generic companies, Bar Laboratories, sued on the grounds that this was a criminal offense, not a regulatory offense, and so that they should be held accountable. But the courts didn't punish the agency, even though they agreed that the FDA had been taking bribes. So you can imagine that the drug companies did not feel very good about this whole situation. And that really changed the way they operated. And I think on this slide, you probably heard of some of this before. The companies actually needed to befriend the FDA because if they didn't, the FDA could arbitrarily destroy the products or not approve any new ones. And so even though it was mostly doctors and scientists that had been running the drug companies, that shifted. It shifted because a lot of the companies decided they had to fight fire with fire. And if, scientists tended to be, well, scientists, they were involved with the data and the possibility of helping people and not necessarily the bottom line. And so the MBAs started taking over. And I remember this well from my years at Upjohn because we were told, actually, that we couldn't develop any more drugs without patents. And the reason that we were told that is because, as I'll show you in a minute, the cost of getting the FDA approval really soared after these amendments. And that was sad because we had developed drugs without patents before because the cost of an FDA approval wasn't huge. But as it grew, of course, it meant that we had to have patents because there was no way, excuse me, there was no way to recover the cost of the FDA approval without some type of monopoly, which of course I don't support that idea, but the regulations made it that the companies either had to have patents or they would not be able to recover their costs. So the MBAs started coming in and their focus was on the bottom line, not on the science. And I saw this gradually happening over my time at Upjohn. It got more and more, the company got more and more managed rather than focused on research. And the revolving door that many of you have heard about with the FDA began right after the amendments. I mean, yes, before the amendments from 59 to 1963, about 10% of the FDA employees would move over to industry. But that was, that's about what you would expect in this type of environment. But by 1969, that number was 72%. 72% of the people who left the FDA went to industry. And the reason they did is the new regulations were extremely confusing. And the companies felt like, we're not going to be able to meet these regulations unless we have somebody who actually can interact with the FDA and knows them and can kind of guide us in how we're supposed to do this stuff. So this was really a reaction to all of these court cases and the things that evolved from the amendments. Now, let's talk a little bit about effectiveness, because as I said before, what happened before the amendments is effectiveness was something that was kind of done in a way that today we might find to be not scientific. Although I have to say, when you hear what happened, you'll question that. Let me get a little bit of a drink here. So in 1911, the Supreme Court of the US had decided that effectiveness was an expression of opinion. And there's a good reason for that. There is no such thing as a drug that works for everyone, at least not that I'm aware of. Some people, just because of genetics or environment or whatever, the drug doesn't work. So if a drug company says a drug works, they're not really saying it works for everyone. They can't. It doesn't. It doesn't happen. So the FDA created a rule about what it would consider to be an effective drug. So it required 2 US placebo-controlled studies with a p-value, I'll explain that in a minute, a p-value of 0.05. If you could add, then if you had that, then when your drug was approved, you could advertise that it worked. Now, what does that mean, the p less than 0.05? Well, it means that if you're doing a study and you see that more people were helped by the drug, you do some statistics, and if the p-value is less than 0.05, what it means is that there's a 95% chance that this drug actually works. 95% out of 100, right? So it's a very high standard, especially when you have to do 2 studies. And what's interesting is that our science isn't good enough to really make that standard work. And let me give you an example. So a drug that saves 2 out of 10 lives would not meet the standard. It would not be statistically significant in almost every case. But a drug that lowered blood pressure by 2 millimeters or 2 points, if you want to think of it that way, would be statistically significant. It could get FDA approval, but it's also what we call clinically insignificant. In other words, if you lower your blood pressure by 2 millimeters, it's not going to make a whole lot of difference. So this is the problem. Our science isn't good enough to design studies that are actually going to give us the information that most people believe that you get out of these clinical studies. So you know, if it does meet that standard, it's probably a pretty good drug. But if it doesn't meet that standard, that does not necessarily mean that it's not helping people, as you can see from the examples I just gave. And effectiveness studies are very costly, the most costly part of drug development. And when studies were done after the amendments were passed, about 10 years after the amendments were passed, they compared how effective these studies had been, the post-amendment process had been versus the pre-amendment process. And what they found is there was very, very little difference, if any. So even though when we think of doctors getting pills from the drug companies, using them and reporting back to the company that the drug was effective or ineffective, we don't think of that as a very good process. In fact, it was just as good as this very fancy process, primarily because we don't have the science yet to design these studies that the FDA is requiring to make them pick up a lot of drugs that actually work. And in fact, the NIH realized this about 15 years ago and said they were going to go back in the old cancer studies and try to pick out the drugs that saved the 2 out of 10 lives. I never heard anything after they said that, so I don't know if they actually did that, but you know, it's recognized. This is a recognized thing. Okay, let me get into some details about what happens with these drugs. Okay, so, and how long it takes to get a drug to market. So on this axis, you see the years of development. This is the time after the company decides it wants to market the drug that it takes to get it from the lab bench to the marketplace. And as you can see here, in 1948 to 1961, the years before the amendments, it pretty much took about 4 years. On average, there were a lot, drugs that were longer, some that were shorter. 4 years was the average. Okay, but after the amendments were passed, look how much it increased. It got up to 14 years instead of 4 years. In other words, 10 years were added to the development time. And I'll explain what this little blip is here later in the talk, but 14 years, it added 10 years to development time. People quite literally died waiting for these drugs, and that had some major effects. So one of the effects was in Britain and in Europe, they got new drugs before the United States did. Now, of course, they had slightly more side effects, right? Because some of the drugs they got didn't go through a more elaborate process, so there were a few more side effects. But breakthrough drugs like propranolol lagged about 3 years behind the time that the Britons got them. And there were studies done that an estimated 30,000 Americans died prematurely because this drug did not come to the US market for 3 years. Now, this drug wasn't the best drug in the world, but it did help people with angina and hypertension. And the problem is that when it did come to the US, it wasn't approved for angina and hypertension, which were its major indications. So a drug can be approved for a particular indication and not for others. Doctors can still prescribe it. They do it what we call off-label. But unless the doctors knew about the great results in Europe, they probably weren't prescribing it until the FDA finally approved it for angina in 1973 and hypertension in 1976. So at this time, while all this was happening, there were more studies on the life-saving effects of the new drugs that were coming out, outweighing the risk factors. So for every life saved by these amendments, people were reporting about 338 lives lost because Americans didn't have access to these drugs. And in fact, I was working on AIDS drugs in the 80s, and the AIDS patients, they said, hey, we can't wait 14 years for new drugs. We need them now. So what they did is they hired black market chemists to make the same drugs we were working on at Upjohn and other companies, and they distributed them throughout the whole AIDS community. And actually, they did a pretty good job. The doctors that they worked with made sure they told the patients, hey, this is what we know and what we don't know about these drugs. And of course, the AIDS patients didn't have a lot of options. So they took some of these drugs. Some of them worked better than others, obviously. And many of them came from Europe because Europe was getting the drugs before we were. So anyhow, if you want to learn more about this, I recommend the award-winning movie, The Dallas Buyers Club. Matthew McConaughey was in it. It kind of goes into what happened to some of the people who tried to distribute these things to the AIDS community. And what happened in California was not much, because the FDA knew that the California AIDS patients were very well connected to the media, and they didn't want to be the ones having fingers pointed at them for killing AIDS patients. So they basically left them alone. But in Texas, things were different. And that's what the Dallas Buyers Club is about. And it's an enjoyable movie. It'll, get some information while learning about what really happened to those poor AIDS patients who didn't have the protection of the media. Okay, so a lot of people died waiting that would have lived if they had these new drugs coming out. Now, I know this group here is very much into prevention. I am too, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. But for some people, drugs can be life-saving, and this has been measured. And I kind of put some data up here for you to see. But basically, the bottom line here is that about 15 million people, estimated, of course, we can't be perfectly sure this is the right number, but 15 million people roughly died waiting from 1963 to 1999 because of the delay in the amendments. And I've broken it down by decade because, as you saw in the other slide, the wait time changed from decade to decade. And the number I used to make this calculation, and this is only for new chemical entities. I have to mention to you, and I should have when I had the other slide up, all these numbers that I'm showing you are for new chemical entities. In other words, a truly new drug, not a drug that's changed from the intravenous formulation to the oral formulation. These are for truly new drugs. And these drugs were the ones from 1970 to 1991. And I was actually surprised about how many people it was claimed that drugs saved. So I actually went back to the data and found out that most of these saves were in the cardiovascular area. They took out the number that they felt was helped by surgery. They took out the number that they felt was helped by lifestyle changes. And what was left, of course, was the impact of the drugs. And that's one of the ways in which this is calculated, not the only way. I believe, and I can't show you numbers on this, this is my personal opinion, that drugs put on the market after 91 were not as good as the ones before. And we'll get in a little bit to why that's probably true in a little bit later in my talk. But, drugs can save lives. They're not perfect. They have side effects. They can kill too. And of course, it's the risk-benefit ratio that we have to be concerned about. Okay, now you might figure out that if we went from 4 years of development to 14 years of development, we're going to have more costs. Of course, you would be right. It doesn't take a scientist to know that, right? It's obvious. So on this slide, what I've done is I've plotted the research and development in millions of $217. And that's the dark squares you see are the post-amendment numbers. These are from Tufts. There's been some dispute if these are right. We'll talk about that in just a second. And you can see it's exponential. You remember I told you in the beginning that the regulations kind of metastasize? Well, and the reason this is happening, remember, some drug executive has to sign on the dotted line that they support this approval, and they're on the hot seat. if Congress gets all upset because people are calling in about side effects. So they keep adding more and more studies so that they can go to Congress and say, well, we made sure these guys did this study and that study and this study and that study. And who would have known that this would happen? And so they they have some justifiable deniability. These are out-of-pocket expenses. And we'll talk about, for those of you who know about economics, we'll talk about capitalized costs in a minute. So this is what happened after the amendments. The costs soared. This point here represents $1.4 billion per new chemical entity in out-of-pocket costs. These are actual outlays that the pharmaceutical company makes. Down here in these open squares, we have some estimates of what it costs to get a drug on the market prior to the amendments. And if you extrapolate from there, which, okay, this is not, this is a long time. It's hard to really say this would have happened, but this is, a guesstimate of what costs would have been had we not had the amendments. So it would probably be more around here instead of way up there. It would have gone up. You can see it's going up. It just probably wouldn't have gone up that much. Okay, so I want to say a few things about these costs. The numbers have been disputed. The reason I used the numbers on the last slide that I did was because the Tufts numbers have the same methodology. That whole curve, same methodology. We do not have any other estimates that I'm aware of where the same methodology has been used for those decades. So the trend is right. Maybe the number is a little too high or low. I personally think it's a little low. And we'll talk about this. I mean, there's been a lot of people who say, oh, no, it doesn't cost that much. We tracked the cost of getting this particular drug to market. But what they don't realize is that 80% of that cost are the failures that precede the 20% successes. And so, in other words, you have to, if you track one drug, you have to multiply that number by 5 in order to really get a pretty good handle on the average cost of getting a new chemical entity to market. Also, most of these cost estimates that we hear from Public Citizen and things like that, they don't include the failures. And they don't include phase 4 studies, post-marketing studies. So when the drug gets an approval, sometimes the FDA says this approval is contingent on you doing some extra studies. And then, of course, the company is supposed to do those phase 4 studies, sometimes does and sometimes doesn't. And that depends on whether or not the FDA really gets on their case or not. Now, I told you I would talk about capitalized costs. I think the easiest way for a person who's not an economics person to understand this is, if you go out and buy a home and you get a mortgage and you're paying $100,000 for your house, over the time of that mortgage, you might actually pay out $200,000 because you got to pay interest too, right? Same thing with drugs. And so what economics people do when they see a 14-year development time is they kind of make that calculation. What would the interest be on a loan if the company had to get it? And so those out-of-pocket costs of $1.4 billion per new chemical entity that I showed you doubles if you capitalize them, roughly doubles. So I just kind of wanted to point that out. And we're going to see a capitalized graph in a little while, which is why I'm telling you this. Okay, now the problems with the high costs. I told you earlier, patents are needed to pay for FDA approvals now. It's almost impossible to recover your cost without them. I prefer not to have them. I mean, I have several patents that I got with the Upjohn company and one I got without. But, if you want to get anything developed today, you have to have a patent. And part of the reason is only 2 out of 3 out of 10 drugs recover their approval costs, which means that the entire industry has had to make some big changes. And one of the big changes it makes, it doesn't work on drugs that you take once or twice and then put back on the shelf. They are focusing on lifetime treatment, diabetes, hypertension, diseases where they can sell a drug for your whole lifetime. And the reason is that's the only way they can make costs. In fact, the whole industry is built on blockbuster drugs. They're the ones that are paying these extra costs for these, 7 to 8 drugs that don't make back their approvals. And chronic drugs, lifetime drugs, are more dangerous because your body can handle taking a drug and detoxifying it 1 or 2 times much more easily than it can if you take it every day for decades. The body gets tired, problems happen. Okay, so with all of this going on, what you might imagine is that we had a lot of less new drugs than we did in the past, and you'd be right. So what you're seeing here now is in these blue lines, you are seeing the actual number of new chemical entities. You see there's a little bouncing around that companies did from 1948 to 1962. And what you see in the red is the modeling of this. And you see it's pretty good, right? So when this modeling process was used for post-1962, what we should have seen was something like this red line. Instead, what we actually saw was the blue line. In other words, there's a great decrease, probably greater than 50% of new drugs that came out. And what this meant is the industry was hurting, and it created other problems, and more regulatory band-aids were put on this. And I'm not going to get into it in this talk. It's too much. But what you saw on that last slide was loss of innovation. And there's been a lot of studies done on this to try to predict how many drugs were lost. And the working number is 50% late stage dropouts, which means that the drug company gets 3/4 of the way through the drug development process and then realizes that the costs of getting the last 25% through doesn't make any sense because the drug isn't going to make much money in the market because like a competitor has a better drug that came out, or whatever. There's a lot of reasons. But early stage loss is probably even bigger than that. And I'm going to tell you a personal story about that. So, as I said, I do have some patents. So one day I get a call from the FDA and they say, Dr. Ruwart, we understand that you have submitted a patent application for prostaglandins and liver disease. I said, yes, that's true. They said, we are so excited about your work. There is nothing to treat liver disease except bed rest, which doesn't work. And we want to do everything we can to help your company get this drug on the market and save lives. Oh, I was thrilled. I was young and naive. I didn't know any better. I thought that this would actually make a difference in getting drugs to market. And frankly, at that point in time, my first reaction to being at a drug company was, how does anything ever get out the door? There's so much to do to get something out the door. How does it ever happen? So I was all excited. But the problem is this. When I talked to my management, they said, well, the problem is that we don't know how to measure an improvement in liver disease easily. The standard way to do it would be to take a biopsy, but you can't do a study with lots of people and take a biopsy every month, at least not easily. I mean, these are sick people. And that means we had to guess about a lot of stuff. We had to guess what dose to give these people. We had to guess how often we had to give it. Once a day, twice a day, 3 times a day. How long we had to give it. 6 months, a year, 2 years, we didn't know. And if we guessed wrong on any one of those parameters, we would not get the statistical significance of P less than 0.05, and we would have to then redesign our study and start all over. And this study was going to take probably at least 3 years, probably longer. So when management and I talked this over, we realized that by the time we went through the animal studies we had to go through, the human studies we had to go through, if we didn't guess right the first time, we'd have to start over on the human studies, and the drug would be off patent by the time we got it to market, which meant, guess what? we couldn't recover our approval costs. So we did not develop that compound. And it's pretty sad because there eventually were some human studies based on my work that happened in another drug company showing that, yes, the drug does work. Of course, they probably wouldn't market it for that because, again, they didn't probably want to go through the whole approval process. But I think they were trying to piggyback it onto maybe another indication. So don't know, haven't seen it. Somehow it got dropped. Okay. The point is this. Every time a new drug looks promising, management does this calculation. Is it going to be able to recover these huge approval costs? Which, of course, if you is at least in 2008, when this last point was put on that graph, was either 1.4 billion out of pocket or 2.8 billion capitalized. And the answer in most cases is no, unless it's a chronic treatment. And so there's a lot of early stage loss. So we probably have lost way more than 50% of our innovation. Why is this important? Because it doesn't matter how rich you are. If a discovery hasn't been made about a particular disease, about what works, you can't buy it for any price. So loss of innovation is literally a matter of life and death. And if you calculate based on this 50% number, rather than the bigger number, which probably is, I figure about let's say 27 million people died prematurely between the amendments and 2010. If you estimate that the lost drugs were only 25% as effective as current ones, and I'm being a little conservative here, and but I also recognize that if you double the number of drugs you put on the market, you don't necessarily save twice as many lives. There is, I don't want to get into the weeds here, but you have to be careful that you don't make that assumption, and that's why I didn't. I said 25% is effective. Okay, let's continue on. So the amendments have shaved about 5 years off our lives if we consider the loss due to delays and the loss due to innovation. Yes, this is an estimate. This is the best I could do with the data that was available. And this loss ripples out into the world. It's not just happening in the US because the rest of the world tries to follow the United States now. Didn't back when the amendments were passed, but now they try to imitate the United States. So this continues to be bad news for everybody. Now, let's talk about the impact of the high cost of getting a drug to market versus what price you pay in the pharmacy. Again, this is for new drugs. So what we see here is the average cost of a branded prescription drug, which is basically what the NCE is. And then the R&D costs for the NCE. And this is the point, the pre-amendment point right here. And as you can see, after the amendments, for a while, things were kind of stable, and then they shot up. Whoa, and they're still going up today. Now, I want to point out that this would not have happened with the amendments. How do we know? Well, we know because there are, prior to the amendments, drug prices were dropping by about 30% per decade. Dropping, not growing, dropping. And of course, that's because as more and newer drugs came to market, and there was such great competition back then, pre-amendment, there were a lot of little drug companies, big drug companies, but there was a whole spectrum of drug companies, as we'll see in a minute. So if you assume that that graph is correct, then what you see is that had pre-amendment trends continued, pharmaceutical prices would probably be 5 to 10% of what they are today. And I did put one statistic in here. the drug prices did fall from about 32% from 49 to 61.